Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this plenary panel on what are innovative approaches to scaling resilience from South Asia. My name is Jaideep Prabhu. I'm a professor of marketing at Cambridge University's Judge Business School, where I research and teach innovation, particularly in emerging economies. That's what I do as a day job. In my spare time, I moonlight as a member of the extended BRAC family, working on research programs, attending events here in Bangladesh, but also in the UK, and very importantly, attending the Frugal Innovation Forum. I've attended all the forums, and I'm delighted to be here at the 4th edition of the Frugal Innovation Forum. It's also a great pleasure to be moderating this panel with two very distinguished experts, Professor Anand Nishat on my left, Mr. Hossein Zillur Rahman on my right. Thank you very much for coming. These very distinguished experts have done many things in their career. Their extended bios are probably in your bags, so I won't go through all the details, but let me say a little bit about each of them. Anand Nishat is a pioneering expert of water resource management and climate change in Bangladesh. He is a professor emeritus at BRAC University, where he was also vice chancellor. He's engaged in carrying out various research projects in the field of climate change and environment with the Center for Climate Change and Environmental Research at BRAC University. He was the country representative for Bangladesh, followed by Senior Advisor Climate Change Asia region in the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Mr. Hossein Zillur Rahman is an academic, economist and policymaker from Bangladesh, trained as an economist and political sociologist. He's renowned as a poverty and governance specialist here. He led the drafting of the poverty reduction strategy of the government in 2005 and was a member of the Independent South Asian Commission on Poverty Alleviation. He founded the Dhaka-based think tank Power and Participation Research Center in 1996. And prior to that, for over 20 years, he was a leading researcher at the Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies. So before I invite our experts to share their thoughts on resilience, let me say a few things to set the stage for this session and what you might expect from it, what we're trying to achieve by this plenary. I want to thank Dr. Musa for his very interesting and helpful introduction to resilience and frugal innovation. Three things that I would like to take away from that talk. First of all, the notion of resilience itself. One of the things that interests me about resilience is not only people's ability to bounce back to where they were before, but actually to learn from that experience and to be in an even better place, in a sense, than where they were before. And this is where I think the whole notion of creativity and innovation comes in. And I'm very interested in the notion of how shocks and adversity can spur people to be creative. So that's the first point. The second point, Dr. Musa was saying how resilience operates at many levels. At the most basic level, it operates at the level of individuals and households. Then you have communities and organizations, and then you have national or regional levels of governments. And resources play an important role in people's ability to bounce back and be resilient. Of course, there are physical resources, tangible resources, infrastructure, finance, and so forth. But what interests me is also intangible resources, people's creativity, emotional capabilities at the individual level or household level. And then at the organizational level, their social capital, their networks, how organizations are organized in order to deal with adversity. And finally, at the national level, regulations and laws and how governments can use those intangible resources and institutions to become more resilient. A final thing that interests me is the link between the individual level, the bottom up, if you will, and the national level, the top down. It seems that there is a very interesting relationship between these two. Obviously, you need to have bottom-up resilience. You need to have individuals and communities being creative in the face of adversity. But you can't leave people to their own devices. It strikes me that you need some level of top-down coordination as well. But perhaps you can also have too much of that. If there is too much top-down coordination, then maybe it robs people of their agency and it suppresses their own creativity. So what's the optimal level? So those are some thoughts to get us started. What can you expect from the session? I'm hoping that at the end of the session, you will appreciate how fundamental this notion of resilience is and how intimately it is linked to many aspects of development, how it's linked to issues of vulnerabilities of all sorts, of how it's linked to diversity, how it's linked to frugal innovation, and so forth. And I hope you leave the session realizing that regardless of what you do in the area of development, resilience is a fundamental notion. Okay, so let's now turn to our experts, and I would like to invite Professor Nishat to share a few thoughts that he has. I believe he has a few slides. I know that you have worked extensively on climate change and environment, and I'd like you to say a few things linking those notions to resilience. So.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning. Well, I'm an academic, and therefore when I sit down, I talk, my brain doesn't work, so I have to stand up. Because that is the way an academic is used to. The second thing, I'm an engineer, and that is a big problem. Problem is I need a dimension. I get lost when terms are used where I cannot put a width and a depth and a size. I have to get hold of it. I have to do a drawing. Like I can understand this room. It has a vault type design, and this is reasonably good in acoustics. We can measure it. So when I was asked to talk about resilience, obviously I was thinking in terms of climate change. And in climate change domain, we used to use the word adaptation. And that has now been changed to resilience, improvement of resilience or building capacity. And over the last 2 years, it is being changed to transformation or transformative society. Now, often the academics picks up new words, creates jargons, but essentially what it means and how does the climate change resilience differs from the traditional understanding of resilience in the domain of, or in the fields of disaster management, I want to explain that to you. So, like in any academic, we like to start with a definition. Google it, this would come up. And they say it is simple definition. There are complex definitions, of course. Simple is ability to cope, to become a strong, healthy, or successful again after something bad happens, which is a natural disaster, a storm surge. The people in Satkhira, they have not recovered fully because the salinity level is very high, but they are working very hard. Or it is the ability of something to return to its original shape after it has been pulled, stretched, pressed, or bent. That definition is close to civil engineering, my original subject. Resilience does not only refer to individuals, the concept can be applied to an organization. In the field of economics, resilience is the ability to recover growth after a crisis. So you need a crisis. What is disaster? Disaster is something which you cannot manage normally. You need external assistance. That's a disaster. Concept of resilience may be applied to communities or even to entire societies. Societal resilience, which is the capacity of society in all aspects and facets to overcome the consequences of an attack while preserving its culture. Bangladesh is a resilient society. Despite all attack on Bangla culture, we have survived. Tagore's song was banned in 1965, totally banned. We protested, or we came out by organizing musical program on 1st of Boishak at 6 a.m. The younger generation would not understand, but I understand because I was on the first event that was organized. That was a sign of resilience. We will not change We will not compromise with our culture. I invite you on 14th April in Dhaka. You will see near Sheraton 3 million people moving around, having hilsha. So that's our culture. Expressions such as resilient business and resilient community appears in research literature. Resilience is emerging as the dominant paradigm for risk management. And therefore, we need to understand risk and risk associated with climate change and natural disaster. Now, please understand climate change is real. It is happening. We had nor'westers on 15th February this year, which we normally have on 15th April. It has big impact on agriculture, big impact on fisheries, livestock, ecosystem, and biodiversity. Stable situation is not going to arrive or is not going to happen. This is IPCC. All 195 countries of the world has agreed to this, including USA. I don't know what would happen if Donald Trump is elected as president. Otherwise, there is no doubt about it. And it is agreed that global warming is unequivocally the result of human activities. Unequivocally means in statistical terms with a confidence of 95% plus. The present confidence is about 95.7%. Science is clear, scientific consensus is clear, the whole world is to collectively work on that, and this has gone to the top political policy agenda. And this is, it looks like. If you see, so this is what happened over the last 1,000 years. And now, since 1860, it is changing, and we are somewhere here. Now, I used to teach hydrology, and I used to tell my students, collect data for last 30 years, do the projection, and you will get what is going to happen in next 50 years or 100 years. It's no longer valid. Past is no longer the future. You have to generate it and produce it. And if business as usual goes on, the temperature could go up as high as 6 degrees. Now, if it goes above 2.5 to 3 degrees, please take note of my next statement. The food production in the whole world would become half, maybe 1/3. Think of the serious shortage of food globally. People will migrate. Why people from Syria are coming to Turkey and then trying to go to Germany? According to Mr. Al Gore, there has been drought in northern Syria for the last 5 years. Agricultural productivity had gone down. Therefore, they are coming to, their capital cities or major towns, and that is the whole problem. At least 1 million people are dying or about to die or in serious condition in Ethiopia and other countries because of serious drought. Bangladesh has been able to solve it. Bangladesh is a resilient society. We have 70% of the country under irrigation. Last year in 2015, the rainfall in the northern part of Bangladesh was 30% of the expected average. We had irrigation in the peak of monsoon, covering the whole country. That is why we are a resilient society. We had heavy rainfall in the southern part, drainage congestion. The rural areas, countryside of Bangladesh is quite ready, but the urban areas are not ready. Dhaka could be the worst city in 30, 40 years' time in the world, not for pollution, but for not being able to manage the drainage congestion. Dhaka is ready for 60 millimeters a day. You remember this year in February, the book fair was about to be, was in jeopardy because we had 8 millimeters of rainfall. Drainage is going to be a serious issue. 300 millimeters rainfall would be very common, so you must prepare for that. And the whole world has promised on 12th December 2015, few days back, at 7:30 p.m., I was there, sitting. It was delayed by 2 hours because USA and China was fighting over 2 words, shall and should. Finally, should won, not shall, anyway. They agreed that they will keep the temperature of the world well below 2 degrees Celsius and then bring it back to 1.5. It is a promise by all 195 countries of the world. And that whole decision would be a legally binding document. Any country which violates would be penalized. The system worked in Kyoto Protocol. There was a 10-member tribunal who used to try the countries who violated. But in that case, this was the duty of the developed countries. Incidentally, I was one of those 10 for 10 years. Now, all countries of the world would do that. But will they be able to achieve? My answer is no. So the current target is to keep the temperature rise somewhere here. My prediction, it is go to 3.5 to 4 degrees, and then world would be able to pull it back, which means there would be serious food shortage, serious problem of migration, health would become serious, ecosystem and biodiversity would not be able to cope up. And that is why we need to talk about resilience or building resilience immediately. The whole world is worried. Anytime two prime ministers, two foreign ministers meet anywhere in the world, or more of, many of them, climate change is a top agenda. The Prime Minister of Canada, who came to USA basically to talk about climate change. Prime Minister Hasina meets Prime Minister Modi. The report, there are 2 paragraphs on climate change. Why the world is worried? Threat of food shortage, threat of migration, livelihood security, water security, and health security would be threatened. But most importantly, the intensity and frequency of natural disasters are going to increase. And that's a big threat to resilience. It's the women and children who suffer most. It is the poorest of the poor who suffers most, and they must be supported, biodiversity and ecosystem, etc. So what is risk? Because the risk could increase. Now, this is important. In the disaster risk reduction school, that is the Sandai framework or Hyogo framework, according to them, risk is a function of hazard and vulnerability. Hazard is probabilistic, vulnerability is non-probabilistic, but the product has to be probabilistic. It may happen or may not happen. But in the climate change adaptation school, which is just emerging, and there's a big fight going on between these 2 schools and the 2 groups of academics, risk is hazard time, exposure time, vulnerability. And vulnerability is sensitivity by adaptive capacity. So the risk is high if exposure is high. Risk is high if the sensitivity is higher and if adaptive capacity is lower. I will give one example. There was a big cyclone in Philippines, Haiwan, which had killed possibly 20,000 people. A similar event having in the coastal belt of Bangladesh, I would say the death would be 0. There would be loss of property. Mohashen, which attacked in 2014, only 1 person died because a tree fell on him. So slowly we are building resilience. That is our disaster management machinery. We have reasonably good flood warning, cyclone warning system, and people listen to that. That is a very important element in going towards resilient society. So risk reduction, risk is a chance of a disaster, and so reduce risk by increasing adaptive capacity. In disaster risk reduction approach, it does not address the dynamics between the hazard and vulnerability. In the climate change adaptation approach, we aim to reduce risk by enhancing adaptability. Funds should be available. Money globally would flow from 2020, and please imagine $100 billion should be handed out every year. So if you are prepared to go for adaptation, which means improve your resilience, improve your adaptive capacity, money would come in. So the approach is, how do we handle this risk business? Reduce exposure, transfer and share risk is a nice way of talking about introduction of insurance business. Prepare, respond, and recover, reduce vulnerability, increase resilience, and have the whole society transform. So this is a new thing that is coming up. At least 500 students are doing PhD on this particular term. Global thinking process from adaptation to creation of resilient society. We need to improve our knowledge on the factors that define resilient societies vis-a-vis climate change impacts and natural disaster. Building resilience requires an integral transformational approach. integrating climate resilience into core national development program planning may catalyze transformational change. In Bangladesh, the law says any project we do, climate change must be factored in. Otherwise, we will not be able to handle the risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those thoughts on the link between climate change and resilience, some very sobering stats and facts there. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Rahman. I know you have done extensive research on the macroeconomic situation in Bangladesh and particularly on urbanization. And I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on the links between those topics and resilience.
Well, I'm half academic, but nevertheless, I'll also stand up because it's physically more comfortable, all right? I want to start out by making a general point. I heard Mr. Musa's discussion also, and now our moderator's introduction. I think it's very important that when you talk of resilience, we are not just thinking of instrumental features. We are not just thinking of resources. You briefly mentioned it. I think a critical aspect of being resilient is the mindset issue. Mindset is a very important element of being resilient. You can have, lots of processes, instruments in place, but the Bangladeshis, when we are celebrated for resilience, is most importantly for our mindset, the ability, the desire to stand up, to move ahead, etc., etc. So I think it's very important. This mindset dimensions is a critical part of being resilient. In the north of Bangladesh, this phenomena called Monga, which is extreme poverty, has been around for a very long time. We have been doing research there for a long, long time. But I think what we found very interesting was that it's so important. Even I would hesitate to overemphasize the word shock. Because if you continue to emphasize only shock, you create a psychological milieu in which the poor are unable to construct forward-looking ambitions. They're constantly having to think about how to prevent falling down. But a resilient personality is not just thinking about how to prevent falling down. Even at that point when they are in a shock, they are also thinking how to go ahead. And I think that is a very important feature we need to bear in mind. Because without that, transforming their psychological milieu is very important. Because otherwise, the poor will be condemned always to dealing with shocks and forever being, marching time on the same space. That's certainly not what we want from resilience. But in terms of the macroeconomics and the urbanization and even the climate change, how it is creating new challenges in which the resilient response has to find solutions, I think I'll perhaps make some value by illustrating some examples, how the resilient spirit has worked. And one can, in that sense, distinguish between certain sort of areas where the resilience, you can see almost resilience in operation. Let's say one area is finding new application for an old technology. In the Bangladesh context, this low-lift pumps in the 1980s only used for irrigation. These so-called shallow pumps. Throughout 80s, there was restriction. They could only be imported from certain places, used only for that purpose. In 1987-88, we had massive floods. There was, at that point in time, a field need for people to move quickly to save themselves from the floods. Suddenly, what happened was that I think Professor Yunus also had a hand there. A new application for the earlier technology was found, whereby the shallow pump was used to mechanize the boats, the country boats. And in 3 years or 4 years, entire river transport sector of Bangladesh was transformed. It's now completely mechanized. You had a transfer, a new application to solve a new problem. Some years later, I went to North Bengal, and I was astonished to see another application. And this is how the resilient spirit really works. You have a rice boom, production has increased. The challenge for milling the paddy from the field is there. The rice mills typically are very capital intensive, big structures. What we found was these local community-based entrepreneurs who are practically created mobile rice mills. With those machines, they would camp near a village and say, you can come and get your rice milled here. Another application in place. Now, rural roads have come up, people need to move. You have another application, which is sometimes unsafe, which are these what's called the sort of Nasiman Karimans. These are these transports which are not really modernized. But I think I remember at the Grameen Trust, there was an attempt to make this more scientific in a way. But the example here is about how a well-known technology, which was used only for one purpose, how over time society found new uses for that and thereby solved new problems. That's what I would call really resilience. Another example I would give is about when two types of innovations come together, packaging sort of. Packaging as resilience. Example here is, and this is linked to climate change also perhaps, that we have energy needs, electricity, taking it to the, extending the grid to offshore islands, coastal areas, difficult environments, has been difficult. So what we came up with the solar panels. That part was the technological innovation. Where it went to scale was the technological innovation was combined with a financing innovation. The microcredit model was adopted to enable rural households to get access to the solar panel and continue with that. And now, so Bangladesh is soon will be known globally for its solar success. Initially, it was for household purposes. Most recently, we have another one in the area of solar irrigation. Again, a small technological innovation started in Savar, but the financing model was also in place. And now you have solar irrigation as a key aspect of how irrigation has been expanded. Again, I would say that that's a resilient innovation which is not just responding to shock, but really creating extending the boundary of the possibilities for those households. Another example I'll give is about in the north of the country, pressured food shortage was mentioned. The people know this word chores, which are essentially sandbars. When the riverbed dries up, you really don't grow anything there. These are sandbars. In the North Bengal, there has been this innovation. I think someone from Practical Action might be here. You had this innovation whereby using a sort of a water hyacinth as a bed, you had started a pumpkin growing innovation, which has now become a sort of a revolution in those areas. A whole new ecosystem has been brought under cultivation with some products, marketing chains, all has developed. Again, this is what resilience at work actually. Coming to the cities, one of the critical challenges is garbage disposal. We have a huge problem there. In fact, it is still a huge problem. I think in Kolabagan, which is in a part of Dhaka, where at the community level, this door-to-door collection by these, almost like a vendor, would go and collect, and give the house owner would give some money, small fee. That has now become, gone to scale actually. So the city corporation just collects from the big dumps, but from the door to those dumps, it's now a private sector activity where NGOs have come in, private entrepreneurs have come in, and even local communities are at work. Again, another example of innovation at work, meeting a new needs actually. So I'll say that, so innovation is a very key element about this issue of resilience. The mindset, I think, is also a very important issue. Asif mentioned about frugal, that's also very important. Some of the I think also resilience is about smartness in the packaging the solution itself. This is the last example I'll give. Sanitation. Bangladesh is again becoming very well known as its success in sanitation. How is it that's happened? The two, behind the scenes stories about this sanitation success. One is, we have been very clever in, instead of addressing the final goal at the word go, we went by intermediate stops. Throughout 90s, whole focus was changing behavior. Instead of fixed point defecation, instead of open defecation, it's unsanitary latrine, but it's a fixed point. So entire population behavioral transformation happened. And once fixed point defecation had become the norm, you then had those unsanitary latrines were incrementally transformed into sanitary latrines. And here also the technology was a low threshold technology. The ring slab latrine was one where it did not require the government to distribute these sets. Local entrepreneurs could produce them because they are low threshold. And thereby it went to scale very fast. And I think compared to India, sanitation is again another major success of Bangladesh. Classic example of frugal innovation, going to scale, the spirit of resilience, and a sort of thinking through the solutions in a very smart manner. So I would say that these are some of the examples I give, that we need to think of resilience not just from that desperation sense, but it's from a strength sense, that we will deal with shocks. Shocks happen in USA also. They deal with shocks. But shocks must not constitute our mental universe. They are an event. They are a reality. We respond to them. Our mental universe must be a much more forward-looking mindset. And that's, I think, the key to being resilient. Thank you.